Getting your instrument rating will have some obvious uses, like not having to cancel trips due to marginally bad weather, and then just in general making you a better pilot. But there are a few non-obvious situations where I've thought to myself, that's actually really helpful to have an instrument rating there. Here are some of those. The first is when you're flying into busy, controlled airspace, like Class Bravo airspace. I find that coming back into Addison, which is in the middle of the Dallas Class B, is sometimes way easier if I'm just flying IFR. Like, you don't have to worry about Class B avoidance or getting cleared into it or whatnot. And so for the most part, air traffic control literally just gives you a vector or tells you what to do, and you don't really have to think too hard about it. So even on like bright, sunny days, if the airspace is crowded, I'll file IFR coming back into Addison so that the hard work is just kind of left to ATC. Thank you guys. But even if you come back VFR, like an added bonus of having your instrument rating is you'll be way more proficient on the radio. Speaking of airspace, another place that having an instrument rating is super useful is actually when you're flying VFR at non-towered airports. Now, before I had my instrument rating, anytime I'd hear someone talk about, hey, we're on the approach, or we're over the final approach fix, or we're going missed, or we're over the published hold, or whatnot, and I was in the same airport with him, honestly, I think I just looked the other way, which is a really bad idea. I'm not advocating for that, but I think because I didn't know what it meant, I just thought, well, it sounds like they know what they're doing, so I'll just let them do their thing, and I'll do mine thing. Really, really bad idea. But once you have your instrument rating, you have a better appreciation for what that means. Or at your home airport especially, you can be really familiar with the approaches, so you know exactly, when they say, hey, we're over USETI or whatever, you know exactly where that is. Now, you could argue, and I think you should argue, it's a valid argument that VFR pilots that don't have their instrument rating should go ahead and equip themselves with some of that knowledge to know what they're talking about, they being the IFR pilots, and be familiar with some of the approaches at the airport. In practice, is that really what happens? No, but I think it's something we should think about as VFR pilots. Some of the responsibility, on the other hand, is on the IFR pilots to be able to translate into plain English what they're doing. So don't just say, hey, I'm on the approach or I'm over USETI. Let's translate to the VFR pilots what that means to them, because they might not be familiar with what that is or what that means. You could argue that they should, but you know what? It's the real world, so let's be practical about it. And interestingly, the FAA put out an advisory circular talking about this exact scenario. Now, normally these are great bedside reading. It'll put you right to sleep. But this one's actually really good. It's in plain English, and I thought it perfectly diagnoses this situation. So here's what it has to say. Non-instrument rated pilots might not understand radio calls referring to approach waypoints, depicted headings, or missed approach procedures. IFR pilots often indicate that they're on a particular approach, but that might not be enough information for a non-IFR rated pilot to actually know your location. Bingo! It's better to provide specific direction and distance from the airport, as well as the pilot's intentions upon completion of the approach. So for example, instead of saying procedure turn inbound VOR approach 36, it should be 6 miles south, inbound VOR approach runway 36, low approach only. Or 6 miles south, inbound VOR approach runway 36, landing full stop. It's actually a really helpful resource, so I'll include a link to it down in the description. Another handy time to utilize the skills of your instrument rating is actually during your seaplane rating. So if you ever have the chance to go learn how to fly an aircraft on floats, you'll actually utilize some of these skills here. And no, you're probably not going to be flying GPS approaches into a back lake or something, but there is one particular maneuver that really involves some instruments, and it's when you're landing on perfectly smooth, glassy water. It's called a glassy water landing. And that might seem a little counterintuitive, like, hey, if the water is perfectly smooth, doesn't that mean that's like the easiest, best time to land? And actually, it's not. When you look down, you just see the sky. You see a perfect reflection of the sky, and it's really disorienting because you really don't know where the water starts, and that can be a challenge. And so the way that you have to perform a glassy water landing, and I was lucky enough to actually do this, as you come over the start of the water, you have to be in landing configuration, and I know that specifically because I had to redo that on the check ride. He didn't fail me, but he probably could have. I wasn't in landing configuration. I was a little nose low. So you have to be a little nose high. That way, by the time you hit the water, you're not going to, dig in the front of the floats and roll the airplane. So you got to be in landing configuration, and then basically you're going to eat up a lot of lake doing this, but basically you just have to keep the nose attitude the same and then nail a particular airspeed and then get it into an approximately 150 foot per minute descent that you look on the vertical speed indicator. And so it's almost like a little bit of an instrument approach that you're just hovering over the water, you're barely losing some altitude, and you're just holding it, and then eventually you'll touch down. And I got to experience that, and it's really, really magical. But it really kind of was reminiscent of an instrument approach. I didn't even have my instrument rating at the time, but later on when I got my instrument rating, I thought, this actually kind of reminds me of the seaplane rating. So another kind of interesting time that if you have those skills of learning to develop an instrument scan can really help you even in VFR situations. Now, I recently discovered a new use for the instrument rating, and that is to watch the sunrise. And that might seem counterintuitive since watching the sunrise usually happens on beautiful VFR days, but I had a flight a few months ago where it was dark and gloomy and drizzly and just a crappy morning. But I was doing an IFR trip to see a friend. The weather was good enough, but it wasn't great. It was perfectly safe, but it was definitely IFR. And when I broke through the clouds right at sunrise, this was one of the truly the most amazing aviation experiences of my life that I wasn't expecting. I mean, to go from a total dark and gloomy and drizzly morning to just pure majesty was something that truly was hard to describe. So now I really want to go out of my way to watch the sunrise when it's IFR on the ground, but the tops are low enough to climb above and watch just a completely different scene unfold really rapidly as soon as you bust out of the clouds. So if you haven't done this yet, trust me, put it on your list. One of the most common ways I've used my instrument rating during VFR situations is during rural night flying. Kind of a hard word to say, rural. Especially when you're on camera, everybody's watching you. Rural. Rural. And if you aren't around any city lights and it's a high overcast night, it's honestly kind of alarming that that's still legally VFR, because once you take off, you just can't see anything at all. And it's during those times I've really relied on my instruments, even for basic maneuvers. So even small airports will have, they'll typically have a GPS approach of some kind. So sometimes I'll activate the RNAV just to have it as kind of a helpful guide and a backup, even though it's still VFR outside. So this is one of those times that having instrument rating, it's not legally required, but man, it sure is practical and it sure is safe. Now, there are a lot of reasons to get your instrument rating, even if you don't think you'll be flying an actual IFR that much. So if you do decide to get your instrument, it's really, really important. Hear me say, it's important to expect the certain hard parts about it so that you're prepared. It is a hard rating, but it is so worthwhile. And in the video on the screen, I'm gonna explain to you what some of those hard parts were for me and how I think you can absolutely crush it. So I'll see you over in that video.